The road leading to my grandfather's house was lined with ancient oak trees, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The further I drove into the countryside, the more I felt an inexplicable weight settling in my chest. It had been years since I last visited, and even though the house was the same, something about returning here filled me with unease. The house itself loomed at the end of the long, winding road, a relic of another time. It was large and Victorian, its once white paint now peeling, the shutters hanging crookedly as if the entire structure was exhausted from standing for so long. My grandfather had always been a meticulous man, and I remembered how he used to keep everything in pristine order. Seeing the house in such disrepair was unsettling. I parked my car in the gravel driveway and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long journey. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, the silence punctuated only by the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. I hesitated for a moment before grabbing my bag from the passenger seat and heading up the creaking porch steps. The door opened before I had the chance to knock. My grandfather stood in the doorway, tall and wiry, his piercing blue eyes studying me with an unreadable expression. "You're late," he said gruffly, stepping aside to let me in. "Traffic," I lied. In truth, I had stalled my trip as long as possible, lingering in a diner outside of town until I couldn't justify waiting any longer. The inside of the house smelled of old wood and dust. The same antique furniture filled the living room, and the massive grandfather clock in the hallway continued its eternal ticking. Yet, despite its familiarity, the house felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting. "Your room is ready," my grandfather said, turning on his heel and disappearing down the hall. He didn't ask about my life in the city, didn't comment on how long it had been since we last saw each other. That was just the way he was. I followed him up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the vast silence. The walls were lined with old family photographs, but something about them struck me as odd. As a child, I had never paid much attention to them, but now, seeing them as an adult, I realized that in every single picture, my grandfather stood slightly apart from the others. His expression was always the same, calm, composed, and eerily blank. The guest room had not changed since my last visit. The heavy wooden bed frame, the antique dresser, the lace curtains framing the window, it was all exactly as I remembered. It was unsettling, as if time had stopped in this place. "I'll make some tea," my grandfather said, then left without another word. I sat on the bed, rubbing my temples. The journey had left me exhausted, but sleep felt like a distant possibility. There was an unnatural stillness to the house, as though something unseen lurked just beyond my field of vision. After a moment, I forced myself to get up and explore. I moved cautiously down the hallway, my fingers trailing along the aged wallpaper. The door to my grandfather's study was slightly ajar, and though I knew I shouldn't, I pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with bookshelves stacked with old tomes, a massive oak desk sitting in the center. Papers were scattered across its surface, and among them, something caught my eye, a stack of yellow newspaper clippings. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening as I read the headlines. "Local woman vanishes without a trace." "Cold case, missing hiker still not found." "Authorities stumped by series of unsolved disappearances." Each article dated back decades, the locations spanning different states, different years. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I shuffled through them. Why would my grandfather have these? A sudden creak from the doorway made my heart leap into my throat. I turned to find my grandfather standing there, watching me. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "You shouldn't be in here," he said quietly. I swallowed, forcing a nervous smile. I was just looking around. A long silence stretched between us before he finally nodded. "Tom, the tea is ready." I followed him back down the hall, but the unease in my stomach only deepened. Something was very, very wrong here. The night settled heavily over the house, its silence pressing in like a thick fog. I lay awake in my childhood room, staring at the ceiling as shadows danced from the flickering light of the street lamp outside. No matter how much I tossed and turned, sleep refused to come. My mind was too preoccupied with what I had seen in my grandfather's study. The newspaper clippings weren't just a coincidence. They were too specific, too carefully preserved. The questions churned in my mind. Why would he keep them? What connection did he have to those missing people? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had been interested in true crime stories, or perhaps he had known someone who had gone missing. But deep down, I knew the unease I felt wasn't just paranoia. I pushed the blankets off and sat up. The air in the house felt different now, as if something unseen had stirred. I listened carefully, but the only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. My grandfather's door was closed, and I assumed he was asleep. Carefully, I slipped out of my room and into the hallway, my bare feet making no sound against the old wooden floorboards. The dim light cast eerie shadows along the walls, making the framed family photos seem almost alive. I studied them again, looking for anything I had missed before. My grandfather's expression in each one remained unsettlingly neutral. Unlike the others in the pictures, who smiled, laughed, or embraced, he always stood slightly apart, his gaze never quite meeting the camera. It was as if he had been placed there, rather than belonging. I continued down the hallway, my fingers trailing along the edges of the frames, and then I stopped. There was a picture I hadn't noticed before. It was older, the edges of the frame worn. The image showed my grandfather as a younger man, standing beside someone I didn't recognize, a tall man with deep-set eyes and a sharp jawline. The background was unfamiliar, a wooded area with dense trees. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed something strange. The other man had been partially cut out of the frame, as if someone had deliberately removed him. But why? A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. But the hallway was empty. I let out a slow breath, telling myself I was being irrational. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned back to the photograph and carefully removed it from the wall. The back was blank, no notes or dates to indicate when it had been taken. I held it closer, examining the jagged edges where the other figure had been removed. Whoever had done this hadn't been careless, it had been deliberate, precise. A sudden rustling sound came from downstairs. My pulse spiked. I held my breath, straining to listen. It could have been the wind or the old house settling, but I wasn't sure. Summoning my courage, I slowly made my way toward the staircase. Each step creaked under my weight, but I moved as silently as I could. As I reached the bottom, I hesitated. The living room was dimly lit by the glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the furniture. Then I saw it. The study door was open. I knew for a fact that I had seen my grandfather close it earlier. I hadn't heard him come downstairs. My breath came shallow as I approached. The room was just as I had left it, except now, the stack of newspaper clippings on the desk was gone. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. Someone had been here. I took a cautious step inside, scanning the desk and bookshelves. Everything else seemed untouched. But as I turned, my gaze fell on the wastebasket near the desk. There, crumpled among scraps of paper, was one of the missing clippings. I reached down and smoothed it out with trembling hands. Body discovered in remote woodland area, identified after decades missing. The name in the article was unfamiliar to me, but the location wasn't. It was the same forest as the one in the photograph. A chill settled deep in my bones as I looked up, and found my grandfather standing in the doorway, watching me. The silence between us stretched for what felt like an eternity. My grandfather stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. I gripped the newspaper clipping tighter, feeling my pulse thunder in my ears. He knew I had seen it. He knew I had been snooping. "You shouldn't be in here," he finally said, his voice devoid of emotion. I forced myself to stay calm, my mind racing for an excuse. I couldn't sleep, I stammered, carefully placing the crumpled clipping back onto the desk. I was just looking around. My grandfather stepped forward, his sharp eyes never leaving mine. The dim glow from the hallway cast deep shadows across his face, making his already gaunt features appear almost skeletal. "There are things in this house," he said slowly, "that are best left undisturbed." I swallowed hard, unsure whether he was referring to the house itself or something far more sinister. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, his footsteps slow and deliberate. I remained frozen in place until I heard the creak of the stairs as he ascended to the second floor. Only then did I allow myself to exhale. My hands trembled as I picked up the newspaper clipping again. The name of the victim, the remote woodland location, it was all too much to be coincidence. My grandfather had been there, and the way he had reacted just now confirmed my growing suspicion. He was hiding something. I had to find out what. The next morning, my grandfather was already at the kitchen table when I came downstairs, a cup of black coffee in front of him. He didn't look up as I entered, but I could feel the tension in the air. "Did you sleep?" he asked, his voice neutral. "Not really," I admitted, grabbing a cup from the cabinet and pouring myself some coffee. I debated for a moment before deciding to push further. I was thinking about that old photo upstairs. This time, he did look up, his gaze sharp and assessing. "What about it?" I forced a casual shrug. "The man standing next to you. I don't remember seeing him before." For a split second, something flickered in his eyes, something dark. Then it was gone. "An old friend," he said simply. "Not someone you need to concern yourself with." His words were meant to shut down the conversation, but they only fueled my curiosity further. "I just thought it was strange," I continued, pretending to stir my coffee. "The way the picture was cut. Did something happen to him?" A long pause. My grandfather's fingers tightened around his mug. "He's gone," he said finally. "A long time ago." That was all he gave me before rising from his seat and walking out of the kitchen, leaving his coffee half finished. I waited until I heard the sound of the front door closing before I moved. I had to find more proof, more clues, anything to explain what was really going on. The study had been too obvious a place to hide something important. If my grandfather truly was involved in something sinister, he would have been more careful. I needed to look elsewhere, and I knew exactly where to start. The basement had always unnerved me as a child. It was cold, damp, and filled with the scent of aged wood and mildew. The single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered as I descended the creaky steps, illuminating rows of old boxes, forgotten furniture, and rusting tools. I scanned the space carefully, my heart hammering as I moved deeper into the dimly lit room. It didn't take long before something unusual caught my eye, a large wooden chest, different from the rest of the storage clutter. Unlike the other objects covered in dust, this chest looked recently disturbed. My fingers hesitated on the rusted latch before I forced it open. Inside, neatly arranged in rows, were personal belongings, watches, rings, wallets. Items that once belonged to someone. Items that shouldn't be here. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I reached for a small, weathered leather wallet. I flipped it open, my stomach twisting at the sight of the faded ID card inside. The name matched one from the newspaper clippings. A man who had disappeared years ago. I stumbled back, my vision blurring. My worst fears were being confirmed. This wasn't just some obsession with true crime stories. This was evidence of something horrific. Something monstrous. I needed to leave. Now. But as I turned to flee, a shadow moved at the top of the stairs. My grandfather stood there, watching me. His expression was unreadable, but I saw it in his eyes. He knew what I had found, and he wasn't going to let me leave. The weight of my grandfather's stare pinned me to the spot. My breath hitched, my fingers tightening around the leather wallet I had found in the chest. The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating, pressing against my ribs like an iron vice. His face remained eerily blank, but his eyes burned with something I couldn't quite name, calculation, anger, maybe even regret. "You shouldn't have come down here," he finally said, his voice low, almost weary. I swallowed, my throat dry. "What is this?" I forced out, gesturing at the box of stolen lives. These are real people. They had families. He stepped forward, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the confined basement. "Lower your voice." I recoiled, my back hitting the edge of the workbench behind me. I had never been scared of my grandfather before. Strict, yes. Mysterious, always. But never like this. Never with this creeping, chilling fear seeping into my bones. Did you? I hesitated, the words thick on my tongue. Did you kill them? A pause. Too long of a pause. He sighed. It's not that simple. Not that simple? My heart pounded against my ribs, screaming for me to run, but my legs refused to move. Then explain it to me, I said, barely recognizing my own voice. Another silence. Then he turned away, moving toward the shelves lining the basement wall. His fingers traced the dusty wood before he spoke again. My father was not a good man. The statement was so unexpected, so strangely normal, that it took me a moment to register it. He hurt people, did things I could never understand as a child. And when I was old enough to know the truth, I had two choices: walk away and pretend I never knew, or make sure it never happened again. I blinked, my mind trying to process the implications of his words. You mean? I put an end to it. His voice was so calm, so measured, that it sent another wave of unease through me. But by then, it was too late. He had already left behind a legacy of pain. A cold realization settled over me. And you kept trophies? I gestured toward the chest, my stomach twisting. He finally looked at me again, something ancient and tired in his gaze. I kept proof. Proof that he would never hurt anyone again. My breath shuddered out of me. Then why the newspaper clippings? Why keep track of all those disappearances? His jaw tightened. Because I needed to know if he had more victims I didn't know about. If there were others who never got justice. It was a reasonable answer. It made sense. But something still didn't sit right. Why did you cut that man out of the photograph? I asked, my voice quieter now. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging ever so slightly. Because he wasn't just my friend. He was my brother. I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. Your brother? He nodded, his face unreadable. And he followed in our father's footsteps. The world tilted beneath me. So you... I did what had to be done. His voice was firm, final. And I prayed that no one would ever have to find out. The air in the basement felt heavier, pressing down on me like the weight of all the secrets buried within these walls. I wanted to believe him, to believe that this was the whole truth. But a voice in the back of my mind whispered that there was still more I didn't know. More he wasn't telling me. I looked back at the chest, at the stolen items that had belonged to people who had vanished, and I knew one thing for certain. The story wasn't over yet. The weight of my grandfather's confession hung thick in the air, pressing against my chest like a vice. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything: his father, his brother, the dark legacy he had tried to bury. But there were still too many unanswered questions. I took a shaky step back from the chest of stolen mementos. My grandfather watched me carefully, his gaze as sharp as ever, as if gauging how much I could handle. How do I know you're telling me the truth? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. His lips pressed into a thin line. You don't. A chill ran through me. He exhaled slowly and ran a hand through his thinning hair. I knew this would happen one day, he murmured. That you would start digging, asking questions. That you wouldn't be able to let it go. Of course, I can't let it go. I snapped, my fear and confusion boiling over into frustration. I just found a chest full of dead people's belongings in your basement, and you expect me to just accept your word? For the first time, something flickered in his expression, something like regret. Or maybe it was something darker. I don't expect you to accept it, he admitted. But you need to understand, sometimes, the truth isn't black and white. Sometimes, it's buried in the gray. His words sent another shiver through me. I thought of the cut-up photograph upstairs, the missing brother, the lingering questions that still gnawed at me. What happened to him? I asked, my voice quieter now. A long pause. My grandfather's gaze drifted to the far corner of the basement, as if looking at something I couldn't see. "I stopped him," he said simply. The words were too calm, too devoid of emotion. My stomach twisted. "Ow!" His eyes snapped back to mine. The only way I could. I swallowed hard. My grandfather had killed his own brother. And judging by the collection of stolen items in this basement, I wasn't convinced that had been the last time. I spent the rest of the day in a daze. I couldn't look at my grandfather the same way. Every time our eyes met across the kitchen table, I felt the weight of what I had learned pressing down on me like a heavy stone. I needed answers. Real answers. And I knew I wasn't going to get them from him. That night, while my grandfather slept, I made my decision. I was going back to the study. I moved silently through the darkened house, my pulse hammering in my ears as I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The room was just as I had left it, but this time, I wasn't just looking at the surface. I was looking for the hidden things. My hands trembled as I pulled open drawers, ran my fingers along the spines of old books, searching for anything he hadn't told me. Then, just as I was about to give up, I noticed it. A small key hidden beneath a stack of yellow papers. My breath hitched. A key meant something was locked. And in this house, locked things meant secrets. I turned, scanning the room, and my eyes landed on an old wooden cabinet in the corner. Heart pounding, I crossed the room and inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. I hesitated for only a second before I pulled the door open. Inside was another box. This one was smaller than the chest in the basement, but it was no less ominous. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. What I found inside made my blood run cold. A collection of photographs, dozens of them. Some old, some more recent. But all of them had one thing in common. They were all of missing people. People who had vanished without a trace. And my grandfather had kept their pictures. A lump formed in my throat as I flipped through them, my fingers shaking. Some faces were familiar. I recognized them from news stories, from the clippings I had seen in his desk. But others looked even more recent. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. I felt dizzy, like the floor was tilting beneath me. Had he lied to me? Was this more than just a dark past he had been trying to escape? I needed to get out of here. I needed to leave before he woke up. I stuffed a handful of photos into my pocket, my heart slamming against my ribs as I turned to go. But then, a floorboard creaked outside the door. I froze, my blood turning to ice. A shadow stretched across the threshold. The unmistakable shape of a man. My grandfather was awake, and he knew I had found the truth. The shadow in the doorway didn't move, but I could feel my grandfather's presence like a force pressing down on my chest. The air in the room thickened as silence stretched between us, broken only by the soft rustling of the photos in my trembling hands. I barely had time to shove them into my pocket before he spoke. "What are you doing, child?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, something sharp, something dangerous. I swallowed hard, my mind scrambling for an excuse, a way to explain why I was standing in his study in the dead of night, a box of damning evidence open before me. I couldn't sleep, I stammered. I was just looking around. A slow sigh escaped his lips, and he stepped forward into the dim light of the desk lamp. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something I couldn't name. "You should have left it alone," he murmured. My blood ran cold. I took a step back, but the chair behind me caught the back of my legs, stopping my retreat. My grandfather closed the distance between us with measured steps, each one making my pulse hammer harder against my ribs. "What did you see?" he asked. I hesitated. Lying felt pointless. He already knew. He had known from the moment I started asking questions, from the moment I set foot in this house. "Enough," I whispered. His expression didn't change. "And what do you think you know?" I clenched my fists. "I know those people are missing. I know you kept their pictures. And I know you've been lying to me. flicker of something, regret. Sadness crossed his face, but it vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. He sighed again, rubbing his temple as if I were an inconvenience he had hoped to avoid. "I never wanted you to find out this way," he said softly. My stomach twisted. "Then what way?" I demanded. "Were you ever going to tell me? Or were you just going to let me live here, blind to the truth?" His eyes darkened. "The truth is dangerous." I took another step back. "You don't get to decide what I know." A beat of silence passed, and then his entire demeanor shifted. The softness in his face hardened into something resolute. "You're right," he said. "I don't." And then he moved. Faster than I thought possible for a man his age, he lunged for the open box. My body reacted before my brain could process what was happening. I grabbed the lid and slammed it shut, shoving it off the desk as I stumbled backward. The box hit the floor with a heavy thud, photos spilling out like ghosts in the dim light. "Stop this, child," my grandfather warned, his voice dropping to something cold. "You don't understand." I shook my head, breathless. "Then make me understand." For a moment, I thought he might. He stared at me, jaw clenched, something warring behind his eyes. But then, just as quickly, his face closed off. "I can't," he said simply. That was all the confirmation I needed. Whatever he was hiding, it was worse than I had imagined. I turned and ran. I barely made it 2 steps before his hand clamped around my wrist, yanking me back with surprising force. I twisted, struggling, my free hand swinging wildly until I caught the edge of a picture frame on the desk. Without thinking, I grabbed it and swung. The glass shattered against his shoulder, and he stumbled back just enough for me to wrench myself free. I bolted. Out of the study, down the hallway, my bare feet pounding against the wooden floor. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps steady, relentless. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. I reached the front door and fumbled with the lock, my hands slick with sweat. "Come on, come on." A hand landed on my shoulder. I screamed, twisting away, but he didn't try to grab me again. Instead, his voice was calm, almost sorrowful. "You have nowhere to go." My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared at him. "I'd rather be anywhere but here." For the first time, something in his face cracked. The mask of control slipped, just for a second, and I saw the exhaustion there. The sadness. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "I hope you never understand," he murmured. And then, he stepped back. I didn't wait to question it. I wrenched the door open and ran into the night, my heart slamming against my ribs, the cold air biting at my skin. I didn't stop. Not even when I heard his voice, carried by the wind. "You'll be back." I didn't stop running. The night swallowed me whole, its cold grip tightening around my lungs as I stumbled through the thick underbrush lining the road. My bare feet slapped against the gravel, sending sharp jolts of pain up my legs, but I barely felt it. Adrenaline surged through me, louder than the wind, louder than the pounding of my heart. I kept expecting to hear my grandfather behind me, his calm, measured footsteps, his voice, calling me back. But there was nothing. Just silence. Just the dark stretch of empty road ahead. I forced myself to keep moving, even when my legs burned, even when the trees seemed to close in around me. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get as far away from that house as possible. And then I saw it. A gas station. The flickering neon sign was like a beacon in the dark. My chest heaved with relief as I stumbled toward it, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. It wasn't much, just a single-story building, dimly lit, with an old, dented pickup truck parked by the pumps. But it was something. A place. A chance. I pushed through the glass door, the bell overhead jangling loudly in the empty store. The fluorescent lights buzzed, casting everything in an eerie glow. A bored-looking cashier sat behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. His eyes flicked up when he saw me. "Jesus, you okay?" I must have looked insane, hair wild, face streaked with sweat, clothes wrinkled from my frantic escape. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words caught in my throat. What was I supposed to say? That I was running from my grandfather? That I had found proof, real, undeniable proof, that he was hiding something terrible? I licked my dry lips. I need a phone. The cashier frowned but nodded, reaching under the counter to slide a landline toward me. My fingers shook as I picked up the receiver and dialed the only number I could think of. The line rang once, twice. Then, "This is emergency services." "What's your emergency?" I exhaled shakily. I think my grandfather might be a serial killer." Silence. Then, the dispatcher's voice returned, slower this time. "Can you repeat that?" I squeezed my eyes shut. "I found things. In his house. A chest full of belongings from missing people. Newspaper clippings. Photographs. I ran. I don't know what to do." A pause. The clicking of a keyboard. "What's your location?" I turned, scanning the gas station. The cashier was still watching me. Wearing now? I squinted at the stickers on the counter, lottery signs, cigarette ads, a county name printed in fading letters. I read it off to the dispatcher. "Stay where you are," they instructed. "Officers are on their way." A weight lifted from my chest. "Okay." I hung up and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My legs felt weak, my body trembling as the exhaustion finally caught up with me. I slumped against the counter, my heart still hammering, but for the first time that night, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was safe. And then the bell above the door jingled. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. My grandfather stood in the doorway. His face was unreadable, his eyes locked onto mine. "I told you," he murmured, stepping inside. "You'd come back." My pulse spiked. The cashier looked between us, sensing the tension. "Sir, you good?" My grandfather didn't answer. He just took another step closer. I backed up, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "The police are coming." A slow, almost imperceptible nod. "I know." The way he said it sent a chill through me. He wasn't angry. He wasn't panicked. He was just calm, like he had planned for this. The cashier cleared his throat. Buddy, maybe you should." Faster than I thought possible, my grandfather reached into his coat. I didn't see what he pulled out. I just acted. I grabbed the nearest thing, an old metal display rack, and shoved it over, sending a cascade of snacks and drinks crashing to the floor. The cashier yelped, diving backward as I bolted for the back of the store. There was a door. An exit sign. My only chance. I pushed through just as I heard the sound of something heavy hitting the floor behind me. And then I was running again. The night air hit me like a slap, sharp and cold. My feet pounded against the pavement as I sprinted behind the gas station, my lungs burning. I could hear footsteps behind me, steady, unhurried. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. I darted into the tree line, the darkness swallowing me whole. Branches tore at my skin, my breath coming in panic bursts. The gas station lights faded behind me, leaving me alone in the woods, my heartbeat the only sound I could hear. Then, somewhere in the distance, a siren. Hope surged through me. I turned toward the sound, pushing forward even as my body begged me to stop. If I could just make it to the road, if I could just. A hand closed around my wrist. I screamed, twisting, but his grip was iron. "You shouldn't have run," my grandfather murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "You should have listened." I thrashed, kicking, struggling, but he didn't let go. Then, the crunch of tires on gravel. Flashing red and blue lights cutting through the trees. His grip loosened, just for a second. And I ran. Straight toward the lights. Toward safety. Toward the end of whatever nightmare I had stepped into. But deep down, I knew This wasn't over. Not yet. The flashing red and blue lights blurred through my tears as I stumbled toward the road, my legs barely able to carry me. Gravel crunched beneath my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, the dark outline of my grandfather remained just at the tree line, a shadow against the night. He wasn't following anymore. He didn't need to. A uniformed officer stepped out of the patrol car, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon. "Are you okay?" His voice was firm but edged with concern. I tried to answer, but my throat was dry, my voice lost to the whirlwind of fear and exhaustion. Instead, I nodded, clutching my sides as I bent over, trying to catch my breath. Another officer approached, this one a woman with kind eyes. "You called 911? I forced myself upright. "Yes," I rasped. "My grandfather. I turned to point toward the woods, but the space where he had stood was empty. The officers followed my gaze. "Where is he now?" the woman asked. I swallowed. He was right there. He was following me. The male officer exchanged a glance with his partner before taking a step toward the woods, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Sir," he called. "If you're out there, step forward with your hands up." Silence. The night stretched long and empty, the wind rustling through the leaves. The female officer gently touched my arm. "Can you tell us what happened?" I shivered, though the night wasn't cold. "I found something in his house. Something terrible. He tried to stop me." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What did you find?" I took a shaky breath. "A box. Full of things. Photos, watches, rings. From missing people." The officer's expressions shifted instantly. The male officer's grip on his flashlight tightened. "Where is this box now?" "In his study," I whispered. I ran before I could take it. "We need to check it out," the female officer said. She turned toward the radio clipped to her shoulder and called in backup. "We'll take you with us, but you're safe now, all right?" Safe. The word felt hollow. I wasn't sure I'd ever feel safe again. The ride back to my grandfather's house was suffocating. The squad car smelled of stale coffee and leather, the radio crackling softly with updates from other units. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, dreading the moment we would arrive. When the house finally came into view, my stomach clenched. The lights in the front windows were still on, the door slightly ajar, exactly as I had left it. But something felt different. Off. The officers got out first, moving carefully up the front steps. I stayed behind, watching as they pushed the door open wider and called out. "Sir, this is the police. We're coming inside." Silence. They exchanged glances before stepping through the threshold. I hesitated only a moment before following. The house was still. Too still. The air was thick, suffocating in a way it hadn't been before. Every creak of the floorboards beneath our feet sent my heart hammering against my ribs. The study door was closed. The male officer moved forward, reaching for the handle. I held my breath as he turned it and pushed the door open. The room was empty. No grandfather. No box. My stomach dropped. "No," I whispered, rushing inside. "No, it was here. I saw it. I touched it." The officers looked around, their flashlights sweeping the shelves, the desk, the corners of the room. But the evidence, the proof I had risked everything to find, was gone. The female officer turned to me, her brow furrowed. "Are you sure?" I let out a frustrated breath. "Yes. I swear." He must have. A noise. A soft creak somewhere upstairs. The officers heard it, too. They both turned toward the staircase, their hands moving to their holsters. The male officer took the lead, nodding for his partner to follow. I stayed frozen in place, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. Not until I knew. The officers climbed the stairs, their steps careful, calculated. I held my breath, waiting, listening. And then, a gunshot. The explosion of sound sent me reeling backward, my ears ringing. The female officer drew her weapon, shouting for backup as she bolted up the stairs. I wanted to follow. I needed to know what had happened. But my body wouldn't move. My legs locked in place as a deep, horrible silence swallowed the house. Then footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. And then he was there. My grandfather stood at the top of the stairs, his face a mask of eerie calm. In one hand, he held the male officer's gun. In the other, a knife. Blood dripped from the blade, dark against the wooden floor. My breath hitched. No. He tilted his head slightly, watching me with something that almost looked like regret. I told you, child, he murmured. Some truths aren't meant to be known. I took a step back. The female officer's voice crackled over her radio, calling for immediate assistance. But I knew it wouldn't come fast enough. Not before he reached me. Not before it was too late. The night stretched between us, heavy with the weight of everything I had uncovered, everything I still didn't understand. And then, he moved.